YouTube, how's it going and welcome back. So today I'm going to show you how to take an ordinary tank like this and turn it into something a little more visually appealing like this. Stick around and I'm going to show you guys the exact steps I did to make this. As I go along in this video, I'm going to be listing all the supplies and tools that you need for each section. So the tank I'll be using in this build is an Exoterra 18x18x24 front opening tank. This enclosure will be turned into a bioactive setup for my Crested geckos. This is Exoterra's Aztec themed tank. It does look pretty cool, but I want something more naturalistic. First things first, this whole background has to go. I then take measurements of the width and the height of the new background. With the next few steps, I ended up setting up a station outside. This process can be extremely messy, and my wife just cleaned the house. The main background itself is 1-inch thick insulation foam board. The tools that you're going to need to use are as followed: a drill, a wire wheel, a knife or an oscillating multi-tool to cut the foam board, a tape measure, a pencil, a straight edge to make a straight line with, and a heat gun. I first start with marking the measurements that I took onto the foam board. I'm marking both sides of the foam board so I can connect the lines with a straight edge. For a straight edge, I'm using a level. Now it's time to cut it to size. As mentioned before, you can use a knife or an oscillating multi-tool. I prefer to use the multi-tool because it's faster and easier. I have a bucket on the side of me for the trash. I didn't mention it before, but I have a drop cloth underneath the table to help with the cleanup. Now, it's time to mark out my foam board. Since this background's for my Crested geckos, I thought it would be cool to imitate the trees from New Caledonia. I marked out some of the sections with squiggly lines that I want carved deeper than the rest. For this next step, you're going to need a wire wheel and a drill. This is the messy part. I then begin to carve out the background. While using power tools like this, you need to be cautious. You can use whatever technique you'd like. I follow my lines from the bottom up and then I go side to side to carve out the big portions. Now if you're happy with the way it looks, we can move on to the next step. Now this is when the heat gun comes into play. I highly recommend that you wear a mask to protect your respiratory system. Take your heat gun and at a safe distance away, run it along the carved portions of the background. This will tighten up any of the imperfections and it looks substantially better. Now that I'm happy with the way it looks, it's time to move on to the next step. For this next step, you're going to need several more different things. You're going to need dry lock, non-toxic paints in colors of your choice, cocoa husk, paintbrushes, and a container to mix and hold your paints. I take the dry lock and the paints and I put it all in the mixing container. I'm using a lot of browns and dark colors because I want this to look like a tree. You can use whatever colors you'd like. I then take my paintbrush and I start painting the background. Once I'm satisfied with the paint job, I then take some cocoa husk and I sprinkle it all over the background. I then take my paintbrush and I brush it in. This gives the background a nice texture. Now it's time to install the background. For this step, you're going to need a caulk gun and silicone. I apply small beads of silicone to the back of the glass of the enclosure. I then take my background and I firmly press it into place. For this next step, you're going to need cork rounds, spray foam, and painter's tape. First, I take some cork rounds and I see which ones work best and where I want to place them. These cork rounds are going to be suspended in the air, so I took painter's tape to hold them up into place while I spray foam them. Once spray foamed, they're not going to go anywhere. Now for this next step, you're going to need a knife of some sort. Once the tape is free and I know the cork rounds is secure, I'm going to start carving the foam. I take my knife and I carve the foam how I desire. Once everything's carved, I take the same acrylic paint Drylock mixture and I paint the foam. Now it's time for the fun part. Since this is going to be a self-sustaining bioactive enclosure, I'm going to add a drainage layer. For the drainage layer, I'm using clay hydro balls. Once the drainage layer is in place, I then use a screen to keep the drainage layer and the substrate from touching. If the substrate and drainage layer mix, it'll turn stagnant and it'll begin to smell over time. With the screen in place, I then put in my substrate. This is my version of an ABG mix. Now it's time for the plants. For plants, I'll be using a ruffle fern, a croton, a mother-in-law's tongue, and golden pothos. When full grown, all these plants should be hardy enough for a crested gecko. Once I put the plants in their desired locations, I give them a good misting. After that, I add some sphagnum moss and I spray them down again. I then take some leaf litter and I spread it around the bottom of the tank. All this will be beneficial for the microfauna that I add in the future. They're currently being shipped to me, so they're not going to be in this video. Overall, I'm happy with this build. Even though I worked hard on that tree design, it got covered up. I'm going to give this tank time to grow in before I let the crested geckos move in there. This will ensure that the microfauna become established and the plant's roots become established. This will be a much needed upgrade for them, and I'm excited to watch them explore their new enclosure. If I missed anything and there's any questions, feel free to comment down below. Thank you guys so much for watching. Hopefully this helps you all in a future build, and I'll see you in the next one.